Um, it's been a real pleasure hearing the speakers just now on the panel, and it really reinforces the sense I have of how much willingness there is to cooperate internationally on climate change. We, as the UK, have taken on the task of acting as presidency of COP26, the international talks on climate change next year. And of course, they were supposed to be held this year, round about now. And of course, we had to postpone by about a year because of what was happening with the pandemic. And so many things have been pushed back. And yet what we've found over the last year is that there remains enormous willingness all over the world to continue confronting climate change, making progress on low carbon transitions at the same time as dealing with the public health crisis and helping our economies recover. We've felt great goodwill from governments, business, civil society all over the world, and we're very grateful for that. And we hope to use the longer time that we have now as presidency of these talks to make even more progress. So the context, of course, is quite tough. That globally we've been working together on climate change, I think you can say, for at least 40 years, since the first World Climate Change Conference in Geneva in 1979. And despite all of that, despite the many great examples of progress there have been, we're in a situation where global emissions are still going up structurally, despite a blip over COVID. And in many ways, our resilience as a global community, as an economy, as an ecosystem is going down. And we have to change those two things around. We need emissions going down and resilience going up. And so we need a great acceleration of structural change in the global economy. Now, when we think about how do we help, what can our contribution be as presidency, then we're thinking in terms of three kinds of role or three sorts of outcomes that we can get from COP26. The first, of course, is the formal negotiations, and we hope that we can conclude a fair and balanced agreement that further strengthens the international consensus for action on climate change. The second is nationally determined contributions. In the Paris Agreement, countries all agreed that they would not just make one contribution and then stick with it, but they would strengthen these over time. And we're seeing an incredible movement right now towards consensus that the most important national commitment you can make is to net zero emissions. We all agreed we would aim for net zero global emissions in the Paris Agreement, and now countries are translating that into their own national targets. The UK committed to net zero by 2050 back last year. The European Union is moving towards the same goal. Japan has just in the last few days made the same commitment, and China has said it's aiming for carbon neutrality by 2060. That's an incredible forward movement, and I'm sure the pace of that is only going to pick up. And on the 12th of December this year, our Prime Minister, together with the UN Secretary General, will be inviting world leaders to come to a summit where they will set out even stronger commitments. The invitation is, if you have a stronger commitment on either emissions reduction or adaptation or finance, you can come and have a platform, be part of that summit and tell the world. So, but the third part, and the one I want to speak a little bit more about, is what we're calling our campaigns for COP26. And these are all about stronger international collaboration on the practical challenges of responding to climate change in the sorts of areas that Mr. Abdul and others were just talking about. And we've chosen 5 areas that we're taking on. These are energy, nature, transport, finance, and adaptation and resilience. And each of these is very different, but the commonality is that they require systemic change in the global economy, moving to in the energy system, moving from coal to clean power. In the transport sector, especially road transport, moving from petrol and diesel cars to electric and other zero emission vehicles, in adaptation and resilience, making all kinds of human systems more resilient, sharing expertise, and increasing the flows of finance for that. In nature, reducing the destruction of ecosystems, especially forests, and transforming our agriculture so that it regenerates ecosystems instead of destroying them. And in finance, changing the way financial decisions are made through all sectors of the economy so that they take us towards the Paris goals. Each of these requires deep, fundamental, rapid change in the global economy, and we can do that more quickly, more easily, and with greater economic benefits if we move together. And the energy sector is a very good example of that, for all the kinds of reasons we've just been hearing. We have a real challenge here. We've got about 2,000 gigawatts of coal globally, and that's much more than we want to start with. And on top of that, we have plans globally to build about a further 500 gigawatts of coal. And this is, of course, the worst thing that you can possibly do for climate change, is build a new coal power station. So we have to move away from that. We have to quickly reduce existing coal and cancel plans for new coal. But the opportunity that we're seeing is huge. As everybody knows, the cost of clean power is dropping incredibly quickly. And it's now cheaper than coal and gas in nearly all countries in the world. At the same time as that cost coming down, we're seeing a massive increase in deployment. And it's worth taking a step back and realizing how much faster that deployment is than was expected. Back in 2006, the IEA's central scenario for solar PV deployment in 2020 was around 50 gigawatts. And right now, globally, we have something like 600 gigawatts deployed, more than 10 times as much. So just think about that. Over 14 years, we got it wrong by an order of magnitude. We've been going more than 10 times faster than we expected. That's a huge opportunity. At the same time as the cheaper energy, we've got cleaner air, and we've got 3 times as many jobs being created for every dollar spent on renewable energy as we have on fossil fuels, according to McKinsey. So the challenge is to accelerate this, and the International Energy Agency estimates that the power sector transition needs to move about 4 times faster than it is now to be online for the Paris goals. That sounds impossible, but it's not impossible because we're on an S-curve of technology transition, and we're at the point where the upward slope is increasing. So acceleration is absolutely possible. And just in the last few days, you see more evidence of that. You see the Japanese Prime Minister coming out saying we must fundamentally change our reliance on coal power. And just the Philippines yesterday announcing a moratorium on new coal. These are all going with the trend and accelerating the trend. So for our COP26 energy transition campaign, we want to continue growing the coalition of countries committed to phasing out coal power. That's the Powering Past Coal Alliance. This is very much a group of countries showing leadership in this transition, and it now covers about 30% of the coal plants in the OECD countries. So it's a very serious commitment, and it's undoubtedly changing investor expectations and policy expectations globally. But on top of that, we really want to strengthen international assistance for scaling up clean power. We want to make sure that every country that might be considering a new coal plant can access a clean energy investment alternative that is more attractive. And we know there's a huge amount of international cooperation in this sector already happening. The UK alone over the last 5 years spent about £2 billion on technical assistance and finance in the power sector in other countries. Many other countries have been active as donors too. So have the expert organizations like the International Energy Agency, IRENA, Sustainable Energy for All, and so have the multilateral development banks. What we are going to try to do over the course of the next year and a bit to COP is to bring together these different actors, the energy ministers, the multilateral development banks, the expert agencies, as well as business and civil society experts, and have a very serious conversation with each other and with energy ministers about what would it really take to go faster? How can we provide a higher quality of assistance and collaboration? And how can we all make stronger commitments to cut back on coal power and scale up clean power, working together? As well as looking at those new power investments, we also want to look at the existing stock of coal, and especially looking at those parts of the world, those communities that are most reliant on coal for jobs and provincial revenues and local economic viability, recognizing that that is not a technical challenge about power sector reform, it's a socio-economic challenge. And looking at how can we really grasp that nettle and provide better support between each other for a just transition away from coal. So that's what we're going to try and do. Of course, we're informed by our own experience in the UK, which is that policy plays an absolutely central role. That if you get the policies right, then the investment will flow and the costs will come down and the transition begins to gather its own momentum. And a great example of this is offshore wind. Just less than a decade ago, many of the economists, including The Economist magazine and prominent economists in the UK, were saying offshore wind is a terrible idea. It's the most expensive clean technology known to man, they were saying, and it was generating at about £140 a megawatt hour. But in the last decade, we've seen the cost of offshore wind drop by more than 2/3. And it's now at a level where it's not only cheaper than coal, it's cheaper than gas. And the new fixed price contracts that we've signed recently, we expect when they come into force in a few years' time, not to be subsidizing offshore wind, but actually to be earning revenue for the government at the same time. And that's happened because we put in place contracts that stabilized revenues, that gave certainty to investment, and took other measures like the capacity market that supported the integration of renewables into the grid. So we've all faced common challenges. The ones the other speakers were talking about, renewables integration, looking at storage, grid stability, those are the ones we're all grappling with. But we think if we continue to exchange the best practice between us, take the serious policy steps, we can mobilize large amounts of investment, see rapid cost reductions, and all have these transitions that are growing jobs as well as reducing emissions. So we're really pleased to be able to say that we already have quite strong cooperation with countries in the ASEAN region. We have a 15 million low carbon energy program, which is supporting green finance and energy transitions in Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Philippines. To give a few examples of what that's doing, in Indonesia, that's supporting Indonesia to harness its solar power, wind, and other clean technologies. In the Philippines, we've helped the government set up a market for renewable energy. And in Myanmar, we're working with the Ministry of Electricity to attract international finance, developing standards for solar and wind energy. And just last month.
Sorry, Simon. Maybe I'd like to just interrupt because we are running a bit over time. So apologize for cutting short. But I think you have addressed a few interesting points in your early presentation. We touched upon the 4 different campaigns which is running under the UK COP26. One is energy transition, the transport, the nature-based solutions, and adaptation resilience. And it's really important that we take these campaigns and make it very relevant to APAC market, which is very dynamic. And in some of the markets that you mentioned, access to electricity is absolutely critical. And it's great to see that one of the objectives is to provide that. And it's very heartwarming to see such initiatives being carried out under this campaign. But to me personally, the most important campaign for me is the transportation, because people like you, people like me, we spend a lot of time on road, and so how much are the technologies like EV, autonomous vehicles, fuel cells, which we heard from NG earlier, Toyota, how are these kind of linked to the whole energy transition? Because I don't see the end yet. Do you, as part of the whole COP26?
Well, thank you for giving me the chance to say something about transport, because in many ways that's also my favorite campaign. I mean, nice. I think there's an incredible opportunity for countries to work together to accelerate the transition in, first of all, in road transport. We're just like in the power sector, this is going faster than expected. You look at all of the expert projections, how do those projections change over time? They only change in one direction, and it's up. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the most optimistic people, and they raised their estimate for EV market share in 2040 by about 20 percentage points over a course of 3 years. So that is moving very quickly. What's interesting for me is that cars are a global market, a $2 trillion global market sold across borders. And so if you set tough standards in some big economies, you shift manufacturers' investment decisions, not only in your own market, but all over the world. And we've seen the European Union having that effect in the past. Now, you only need a small number of countries cooperating to shift the entire global market. EU, China, California, that's 3 jurisdictions together account for over half of global car sales. Or if you take the G7 countries plus China, India, Brazil, you've got over 3/4. Now, if they agree to align their regulatory trajectories towards, say, 100% of new car sales being zero emission by 2040 or earlier, then they could actually double the pace of that global transition, be in line with Paris. Now, in terms of the opportunities for that to spill over into other sectors, I mean, the most obvious one is this is where batteries get scaled up. Batteries get scaled up in cars in vastly greater quantities than they do anywhere else. And that will bring their costs down, just like power and wind and solar. They're on that straight line on the log-log graph between cumulative production and cost. And so that will give us cheaper batteries that we can then all use for grid stability throughout the power sector. The other one, you mentioned fuel cells, and I think this is a really interesting possibility, which is that we know we need hydrogen in many sectors, many of the hard to decarbonize parts of the economy. One of the first sectors where we may be able to scale up those technologies is quite likely to be heavy goods vehicles, where it looks like one of the most promising options. So again, if we work together to do that, get some hydrogen trucks onto the road, begin scaling that up, that will help us bring down the costs of fuel cells. And also, if we're using electrolysis to produce green hydrogen, bring down the cost of electrolyzers too, and help us bring hydrogen to the rest of the economy. So I think that's a huge opportunity. And so it's a big priority for us.
And there's no surprise. Again, hydrogen has been a technology that's very much in question right now. And it's good to see many organizations and many of the speakers that I was speaking to in session, they are doing what they can do to create and build more awareness towards the technology, which could be the real key to unlock the whole potential that we are all going for. Perhaps maybe I will take a question from the audience, Simon. The question here says, how can green and sustainable financing and ESG alleviate the issue of fossil fuel standard assets in the energy transition? I know you touched upon earlier, it would be absolutely crime to have any kind of new coal plants, but how do we really pull the plug and tell them to stop? How is that can we manage with this initiative? If you can briefly talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of coal plants have international finance of one form or another, and banks, and also, well, sometimes those are state-owned banks, sometimes they're private banks, but they have a significant amount of influence in determining how easy it is to access capital for new coal plants and for clean power. and the cost of that capital. And we are seeing now a growing number of banks saying that they will not finance any new coal. That's really significant. And I think the most important thing to do is to carry on growing that number and just make it clear that, as the questioner said, coal is going to be a stranded asset. To give one example of that, in the US over recent years, we've seen coal plants closing more quickly under President Trump than they closed under President Obama, despite the fact that Trump is trying to keep them open. So really, it's increasingly going to be cheaper to install new solar and wind than it is to keep on running existing coal. Forget about building a new one, just running an existing one is going to be more expensive. So there's no doubt that stranding is coming. And I think sometimes in green finance, there's a risk that you can get bogged down in long discussions about principles and standards. And I think it's really important to just take a sector-specific view and understand what's the transition happening here, which assets are definitely not wanted anymore, and which are the ones we're moving towards, and then stop financing the ones we don't want. It's really a lot simpler than it's often made to sound.
I agree, but someone's going to do it, Simon. It's not easy.
And I'm glad that the UK and Italy have taken the lead in this whole initiative, because it's always good to start somewhere. So thank you for your wonderful insights, and thank you for addressing some of the questions which were posed to you. I know it was short notice, but thank you so much for coming in.